The moment I stepped onto that sun-drenched hotel balcony and saw my wife laughing into the chest of a man who was not me, the manila envelope in my hand suddenly felt heavier than anything I had ever carried in my life, and in that single frozen second, 11 years of marriage cracked wide open under a cloudless blue sky. Before I tell you what happened next, I want to pause for just a moment. If you believe in kindness, in forgiveness, in second chances even when the world gives you every reason to walk away, please take a second to like this video, leave a comment, share it with someone who needs a little hope today, and subscribe to our channel. Stories like this one matter to our community, and every single one of you who stops to watch, to feel, to believe alongside us makes this a place worth coming back to. Now let me take you back to where it all began, because to understand how I ended up standing on that balcony with divorce papers in my trembling hands, you need to understand the woman I married, the life we built, and the slow, quiet way that love can unravel without anyone noticing until it's almost too late. My name is Marcus Whitfield, and for most of my adult life, I believed I had done everything right. I met Renata Kessler on a rainy Tuesday afternoon in a small coffee shop near the university where I was finishing my engineering degree. She was studying art history, carrying a leather satchel full of books about Renaissance painters, and she had this way of tilting her head when she laughed that made the whole room feel warmer. We talked for 4 hours that first day, long after our coffee had gone cold, and I remember walking home in the rain afterward without an umbrella, grinning like an idiot because I knew, with a certainty I had never felt about anything before, that I had just met the person I was going to marry. We dated for 3 years before I proposed, and I did it the way I did everything back then, carefully, thoughtfully, with more planning than most people put into buying a house. I took her to the botanical garden where we'd had our 5th date, got down on one knee beside the same fountain, and when she said yes, I remember thinking that nothing in my life would ever feel as complete as that moment. We married in a small ceremony surrounded by close family and friends, her sister Delphine crying through the entire vows, my best friend Oliver Bramwell standing beside me as best man, cracking jokes to keep me from shaking too badly. Renata's mother, Vivian, a stern woman who rarely showed emotion, actually wept when we exchanged rings, and I took that as a sign that we were meant to be one of those couples who made it, one of those rare pairs who grew old together without ever losing the spark that brought them together in the first place. For the first several years, our marriage was everything I had hoped for. We bought a modest house with a crooked oak tree in the backyard, the kind of tree that seemed to lean protectively over the porch like it was watching over us. We had our daughter, Poppy, 3 years into the marriage, and I remember holding her in the hospital room, this tiny, impossibly perfect person, and looking at Renata's exhausted, radiant face and thinking that we had built something unbreakable. I worked hard, sometimes too hard, climbing the ranks at an engineering firm downtown, taking on more responsibility, more hours, more stress than I probably should have. Renata stayed home with Poppy for the first few years, then eventually went back to work part-time at a local gallery, curating small exhibits, something that lit her up in a way I hadn't seen since our college days. We weren't a perfect couple, no one is, but we were a good one, or so I believed with my whole heart. The cracks, when I look back now, started small enough that I convinced myself they weren't there at all. Renata began working later hours at the gallery, staying behind to catalog inventory or prepare for a new exhibit, and I never questioned it because I trusted her completely, the way you trust the ground beneath your feet without ever thinking to check if it's solid. She started going out more with her friends, particularly with a woman named Cassidy Thorne, whom she'd met through the gallery a couple of years earlier. Cassidy was glamorous, confident, the kind of woman who seemed to live a life out of a magazine, and Renata seemed to light up whenever she mentioned her. I didn't think much of it at the time. I was glad Renata had a friend who made her laugh the way Cassidy did, especially during a stretch when I was buried under deadlines at work and wasn't giving her the attention she deserved. I told myself that was normal, that marriages ebbed and flowed, that as long as we still loved each other, the rest would sort itself out. Looking back, I can pinpoint the moment things really started to shift, though I didn't recognize it then for what it was. It was about 1.5 years before that day on the balcony. Renata came home one evening glowing in a way I hadn't seen in months, talking animatedly about a new client at the gallery, a wealthy art collector named Trent Calloway who had apparently taken a strong interest in one of the artists she represented. She mentioned him more and more over the following weeks, casually at first, the way you'd mention any acquaintance, but there was something in the way she said his name, a softness, an eagerness, that I noticed but chose not to examine too closely. I was so consumed with proving myself at work, so determined to provide for my family in the way I believed a husband and father should, that I missed the warning signs a more attentive man might have caught immediately. I missed the way she started taking more care with her appearance before gallery events. I missed the way her phone, which used to sit face up on the kitchen counter without a second thought, started disappearing into her purse the moment she walked through the door. I missed the way conversations between us grew shorter, more distracted, punctuated by long silences that used to be filled with easy laughter. It was Oliver, of all people, who first planted the seed of doubt in my mind. We'd gone out for beers one Friday evening, something we tried to do at least once a month to keep our friendship alive despite the demands of adult life, and somewhere between his second and third beer, Oliver got quiet in a way that wasn't like him at all. He asked me, carefully, almost apologetically, whether everything was okay between Renata and me. I told him things were fine, maybe a little strained with work stress, but fine. He nodded slowly and didn't push further, but something in his expression stayed with me for days afterward, a flicker of concern he was trying hard to hide. When I finally pressed him weeks later, he admitted, reluctantly, that his wife had mentioned seeing Renata's car parked outside a hotel downtown on a weekday afternoon when she was supposed to be at the gallery. He said it might be nothing, might have an innocent explanation, but he thought I should know. I wish I could tell you that I confronted Renata immediately, that I demanded answers the moment that seed of doubt was planted. But the truth is more complicated, and more human, than that. I spent weeks in a kind of denial, rationalizing every strange behavior, every unexplained absence, every moment of emotional distance, because the alternative, the possibility that my marriage, my family, the foundation of my entire adult life, might be built on a lie, was too enormous to face head-on. I told myself Oliver's wife had been mistaken. I told myself Renata was simply stressed, distracted by a demanding new exhibit at the gallery. I told myself 100 small lies to protect myself from one large truth that was creeping closer every single day. It was Poppy, in her innocent, unfiltered way, who finally shattered my denial completely. She was 7 years old at the time, sharp as a tack, the kind of child who noticed everything even when adults assumed she wasn't paying attention. One evening while I was helping her with her homework at the kitchen table, she asked, out of nowhere, why Mommy always smiled at her phone like that. I asked her what she meant, trying to keep my voice light, and she said that when Mommy thought no one was looking, she smiled at her phone the way she used to smile at me, back when we still held hands walking through the grocery store. Something in my chest went cold and still. Children see more than we give them credit for, and they rarely have the capacity, or the reason, to lie about what they see. That night, after Poppy had gone to bed, I sat alone in the dark living room for hours, turning the pieces over in my mind, and by the time the sun began to rise, I had made a decision. I was not going to confront Renata with suspicion and accusation, because I knew, if there truly was nothing going on, that kind of confrontation could do irreparable damage to a marriage built on years of trust. But I also could not continue living in willful ignorance, pretending everything was fine while a slow rot spread through the foundation of our family. I decided I needed proof, one way or another, so that whatever happened next, I would be acting on truth rather than fear. I won't pretend the following weeks were anything but agonizing. I started paying closer attention, not in a way I'm proud of, but in a way that felt necessary given everything at stake. I noticed the pattern of a particular hotel's name appearing in her calendar under vague labels like "gallery meeting" on days when I knew for a fact the gallery was closed. I noticed a second phone, hidden in the lining of an old handbag she rarely used, that lit up with messages from a name saved simply as T. I noticed the way she started talking about a girls' trip she and Cassidy were planning, a weekend getaway to a coastal resort 3 hours away, something she had never mentioned wanting to do in all our years together, something that felt, the moment she brought it up with too much practiced casualness, like the final piece of a puzzle I had been too afraid to complete. I did something then that I still think about, something that felt both cowardly and necessary at the same time. I hired a private investigator, a quiet, professional woman named Harriet Voss, who came recommended by a colleague who had gone through something similar years earlier. I told myself I was doing it to protect Poppy, to know the truth before making any decisions that would affect her life forever, but if I'm honest, I was also doing it because some small, wounded part of me still hoped I would be wrong, that Harriet would come back with nothing, that I could laugh at my own paranoia and go back to loving my wife without this poison in my chest. Harriet did not come back with nothing. 2 weeks before the planned girls' trip, she handed me a folder containing photographs, hotel receipts, and a timeline that made my hands shake so badly I had to set the folder down on my desk and walk outside for air. The man in the photographs was Trent Calloway, the art collector Renata had spoken of so casually all those months ago. The affair, according to Harriet's careful documentation, had been going on for nearly a year. The girls' trip with Cassidy was not entirely a lie. Cassidy would indeed be there, but the resort had 2 bookings under Renata's name, one for a shared room with her friend and one, quietly paid for in cash, for a private suite where Trent would be joining her for 2 of the 3 days. I did not scream. I did not throw anything or storm out of the house or demand an explanation on the spot. In some strange way, the confirmation, as devastating as it was, brought a kind of clarity that the months of uncertainty never had. I spent the following 2 weeks moving through my days like a man underwater, going through the motions of work and fatherhood while quietly, methodically, consulting with a divorce attorney named Priscilla Handley, a sharp, compassionate woman who helped me understand my options and, more importantly, helped me think through what I actually wanted the outcome to look like, not just for me, but for Poppy. I decided, after long nights of soul-searching, that I did not want to blow up our lives with a screaming confrontation in our own kitchen, something Poppy might overhear or, worse, witness. I decided instead that I would give Renata the truth on her own terms, in the place where she believed she was safest, where she believed her secret was most protected. I would show up at that resort, and I would hand her the divorce papers myself, so that there would be no more room for lies, no more space for denial, only the truth laid bare in the light of day. The morning I drove to that coastal resort, the sky was almost mockingly beautiful, a deep, endless blue without a single cloud, the kind of sky that seemed to belong to celebration rather than heartbreak. I had told my sister, Delphine's counterpart in my own family, my younger sister Wren, that I needed her to watch Poppy for the weekend, offering no explanation beyond a tired, "I need to handle something." Wren, sensing something was deeply wrong beneath my forced calm, didn't press me for details, just hugged me tightly at the door and told me to call her the moment I needed anything at all. The 3-hour drive felt both impossibly long and terrifyingly short, my mind cycling between rehearsed speeches and complete blankness, between righteous anger and a grief so heavy I had to pull over once, just to breathe, just to remind myself that whatever happened next, I would survive it, and so would Poppy. I arrived at the resort a little after noon, the manila envelope containing the divorce papers sitting on the passenger seat like a living thing, and I remember sitting in the parking lot for nearly 20 minutes before I found the courage to walk inside. The lobby was bright and airy, all white marble and potted palms, entirely too cheerful for what I was about to do. I had gotten the room number from Harriet's report, and I made my way up, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat, my hands damp with sweat around the edges of that envelope. When I reached the door, I could hear laughter from inside, Renata's laughter, unmistakable even through the wood, a sound I had fallen in love with over a decade ago and had not heard directed at me in longer than I wanted to admit. I knocked, and when the door opened, it was not Renata who answered but Trent Calloway himself, a tall man in his early 40s with the kind of easy, expensive confidence that comes from a lifetime of never being told no. His smile faltered the moment he saw my face, some instinct telling him exactly who I was before I said a word. I stepped past him without waiting for an invitation, and there she was, my wife, standing on the balcony beyond the open sliding door, wearing a sundress I had never seen before, her hair loose around her shoulders in a way she rarely wore it anymore, looking more relaxed and radiant than she had looked at our own dinner table in months. When she turned and saw me standing there, the color drained from her face so completely that for one terrible moment I thought she might collapse. The next several minutes are difficult for me to describe with perfect clarity, because everything happened in a kind of slow, surreal blur. Renata's mouth opened and closed several times without producing sound. Trent, to his credit or perhaps simply his cowardice, mumbled something about giving us privacy and disappeared down the hallway, and I never saw him again after that day. I walked out onto that balcony, the same balcony where I had first glimpsed the two of them together through the gap in the curtains from the pool deck below, and I set the envelope down on the small glass table between us. I did not scream. I did not call her names or demand explanations I already knew. I told her, as steadily as I could manage, that I knew everything, that I had known for weeks, that I had come not to fight but to give her the papers myself so she would understand, without any doubt, that this was real, that this was happening, that the life we had built together was over. Renata cried, of course she cried, great heaving sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep and broken inside her, and through those sobs she said my name over and over, along with fragments of apology that felt both sincere and utterly insufficient against the weight of what she had done. She reached for me, and I stepped back, not out of cruelty, but because I knew if I let her touch me in that moment, I would lose the fragile composure I had spent weeks building, and I needed to remain steady, for my own sake and for Poppy's. I told her I would be filing formally the following week, that I had already spoken with a lawyer, that I wanted this handled with as much dignity and as little damage to Poppy as possible, and that beyond arranging custody and the practical details of separating our lives, I had nothing more to say to her that day. Then I turned and walked out, leaving her alone on that balcony with the envelope and the wreckage of the life we had built, and I did not look back, though I heard her calling my name until the elevator doors closed between us. The drive home was the loneliest 3 hours of my life. I did not cry until I reached the halfway point, at a rest stop along the highway, where I sat in my car and finally let go of everything I had been holding together for weeks, the anger, the grief, the humiliation, the terrible, aching sense of loss for a future I had imagined so clearly and would now never have. I thought about our wedding day, about Poppy's birth, about small ordinary moments, Renata laughing at something silly on television, her hand finding mine across the kitchen table without either of us thinking about it, and I mourned all of it, because even knowing what I now knew, even understanding that the woman I loved had betrayed me in the most fundamental way a spouse can betray another, I still mourned the marriage I thought we had. The weeks that followed were among the hardest of my life, and I won't pretend otherwise, because I think stories that skip over the real difficulty of pain do a disservice to everyone going through something similar. Telling Poppy that her parents were separating was, without question, the most gutting conversation I have ever had. We sat her down together, Renata and I, because despite everything, I believed she deserved to hear it from both of us, delivered with as much love and reassurance as we could manage. Poppy cried and asked question after question that had no easy answers. Why, and would she still see both of us, and was it her fault? That last question breaking something inside me that I don't think will ever fully heal. We spent that entire afternoon holding her, reassuring her, promising her over and over that she was loved beyond measure and that none of this was anything she had caused or could have prevented. My family's reaction was complicated in ways I hadn't fully anticipated. My mother, Grace, a woman of deep faith and even deeper stubbornness, was furious in a way I had rarely seen from her, ready to cut Renata out of our family's life entirely and never look back. My sister Wren was more measured, focused entirely on how she could support me and Poppy through the practical chaos of separation. Renata's own mother, Vivian, called me directly, something that surprised me given how reserved she had always been, and through tears she apologized on behalf of her daughter, telling me she had raised Renata better than this and that she was ashamed, though she also begged me, gently, not to let this destroy Poppy's relationship with either of her parents. Cassidy, whom I had once considered something like an extended friend through Renata, sent me a long, guilt-ridden message admitting she had known about the affair for months and had struggled with whether to tell me, torn between loyalty to her friend and her own conscience. I didn't respond to her for a long time, not out of malice, but because I simply didn't have the emotional capacity to process one more layer of betrayal on top of everything else. Oliver became my anchor during those months in a way I will never be able to repay. He showed up unannounced with groceries when he suspected I hadn't eaten properly in days. He sat with me on my back porch some evenings without saying much of anything at all, simply existing beside me so I wouldn't have to sit with the silence alone. He helped me navigate the practical logistics of separating a shared life, dividing furniture and finances and photographs, tasks that seemed impossibly mundane given the emotional devastation underlying them. There is a particular kind of grace in a friend who doesn't try to fix your pain but simply refuses to let you carry it entirely alone, and Oliver gave me that grace every single day, without ever once making me feel like a burden. The divorce proceedings themselves stretched across several difficult months. Renata, to her credit, did not fight me on the major points once the initial shock wore off. She agreed to a fair custody arrangement, understanding, I think, that contesting anything would only prolong Poppy's exposure to conflict between us. There were painful moments, arguments over the house, over finances, over the small material remnants of a marriage that had once felt permanent, but through it all, I tried to hold on to the promise I had made myself on that drive home from the resort, that I would not let bitterness consume me, that I would handle this separation with as much integrity as I could manage, both for Poppy's sake and for my own. It was during this period, somewhere in the fog of paperwork and painful adjustment, that something unexpected began to happen inside me. I had expected the anger to consume me entirely, to define the next several years of my life the way it seemed to define so many people I knew who had gone through similar betrayals. But somewhere around the 4th month, sitting alone in my new, smaller apartment on a Sunday afternoon while Poppy was with Renata, I found myself thinking not about revenge or bitterness, but about the years before things went wrong, about who Renata had been before she became someone capable of what she did, about the pressures and dissatisfactions that might have driven her to make the choices she made, not to excuse them, because nothing excuses infidelity, but to understand them, because understanding, I was beginning to realize, was the only path that led anywhere other than a permanent, corrosive rage that would eventually harm no one more than myself and, by extension, Poppy. I began seeing a therapist, a calm, perceptive man named Desmond Fairweather, who helped me untangle the difference between forgiveness and reconciliation, a distinction I had never fully considered before. He explained, over the course of many sessions, that forgiveness was not something I owed to Renata, but something I could choose to give myself, a way of releasing the poison of resentment from my own body so it would stop eating away at me from the inside. Reconciliation, he said, was an entirely separate question, one that depended not just on my willingness but on evidence of genuine change, accountability, and rebuilt trust, none of which could be rushed or assumed. That distinction became something like a lifeline for me during those months, giving me a framework to process my pain without either collapsing into despair or hardening into permanent bitterness. Renata, meanwhile, was undergoing her own transformation, one I observed cautiously from a distance, unwilling to trust it fully but unable to entirely ignore it either. She began seeing her own therapist, a woman who specialized in helping people understand the roots of self-destructive behavior. Through Poppy, and occasionally through brief, necessary conversations about co-parenting logistics, I learned that Renata had begun confronting long-buried issues from her own upbringing, a childhood marked by her father's own infidelity and the way it had shaped her understanding of love and self-worth in ways she had never fully processed. This did not excuse what she had done, and I was careful, with Desmond's guidance, not to let sympathy blur into justification. But it did help me see her not as a monster, but as a deeply flawed, wounded human being who had made a catastrophic choice, one with consequences she would carry for the rest of her life. The turning point, if I can call it that, came about 8 months after that day on the balcony. Poppy had a school event, a small art exhibition where her class's projects were being displayed, and both Renata and I attended separately, sitting on opposite sides of the gymnasium with the careful, practiced distance divorced parents learned to maintain in shared spaces. Poppy had made a small clay sculpture, a lopsided but earnest attempt at a bird, and when she spotted us both in the crowd, her face lit up with a joy so pure and uncomplicated that it nearly broke me. She ran back and forth between us, showing us both her project with the same enthusiasm, seemingly unbothered, at least in that moment, by the fact that her parents no longer lived under the same roof. Watching her that afternoon, I understood something I hadn't fully grasped before, that Poppy's capacity for joy and resilience was not dependent on Renata and me repairing our marriage, but on both of us continuing to show up for her, fully and consistently, regardless of what had happened between us. After the exhibition, as the crowd was thinning, Renata approached me carefully, the way you might approach someone you weren't sure would welcome you. She thanked me for how I had handled everything, for not turning Poppy against her, for maintaining civility even when I had every right to be cruel. Then, hesitantly, she said something that stayed with me for a long time afterward. She said that standing on that balcony the day I handed her the divorce papers had been the moment she finally understood the full weight of what she had done, not in an abstract way, but in a visceral, undeniable way, seeing my face, seeing the devastation she had caused someone who had only ever loved her honestly. She said she wasn't asking for anything from me, not forgiveness, not another chance, only that she wanted me to know she understood, fully and completely, the damage she had done, and that she intended to spend the rest of her life trying to be someone worthy of Poppy's trust and respect, even if she never regained mine. I did not respond with forgiveness that day, because I wasn't ready, and Desmond had taught me that forced forgiveness, offered before you're truly prepared to release the pain, tends to curdle into resentment later. But I did tell her that I appreciated her honesty, and that I hoped, for Poppy's sake and for her own, that she found the peace she was clearly searching for. It wasn't reconciliation. It wasn't even quite friendship. But it was something, a small, fragile bridge built on honesty rather than illusion, and in the months that followed, that bridge held steady in a way that surprised us both. Over the following 2 years, our lives settled into a new rhythm, one I never would have imagined possible during those darkest early months. I eventually met someone, a thoughtful, grounded woman named Colette Fenwick, a schoolteacher with a quiet strength and an easy laugh, who I met through, of all things, one of Poppy's school functions. Colette never asked me to hate Renata or to speak poorly of her in front of Poppy, understanding intuitively that Poppy's well-being depended on stability rather than conflict, and I loved her more for that patience and wisdom than I can adequately express. Renata, for her part, remained single for a long while, focusing intently on rebuilding herself, on being present for Poppy, on the slow, unglamorous work of becoming someone she could respect again. Trent Calloway, I later learned through the small world grapevine of our shared social circles, had moved on to someone else entirely within a year, a detail that confirmed, if I had needed confirmation, that whatever he and Renata had shared was never built on anything real or lasting. The moment that felt like true closure came almost 3 years after that day on the balcony, at Poppy's 10th birthday party, held in the backyard of my new house, the one with a young maple tree instead of the crooked old oak, though I had made sure to plant it in a spot where it would eventually grow into something just as sheltering. Renata and Colette had, over time, developed a cordial, even warm relationship, both of them united by their shared love for Poppy above any lingering awkwardness between them. Renata approached me near the end of the party, as the last of the guests were leaving and Poppy was collapsed happily on the grass surrounded by wrapping paper and new toys, and she thanked me, once again, for the kind of father I had continued to be throughout everything, for never once making Poppy feel like she had to choose a side. Then she said something that finally, after all that time, allowed something in my chest to fully unclench. She said she no longer asked for my forgiveness because she needed it for her own peace, but because she believed, watching the man I had become through the hardest chapter of both our lives, that I deserved the chance to set that particular weight down, whenever I felt ready, not for her benefit, but for mine. I told her, standing in that backyard with the late afternoon sun slanting gold through the leaves, that I forgave her. I meant it fully, in the way Desmond had taught me to understand forgiveness, not as a reconciliation, not as a forgetting, but as a conscious choice to release the anger I had carried for so long, to stop letting her worst mistake define the rest of my own life. It didn't erase what had happened. It didn't rewrite the pain of that day on the balcony or the months of grief that followed. But it freed something in me that had been clenched tight for 3 years, and watching Renata's face as she absorbed those words, I saw something in her release as well, a burden she had been carrying silently, finally allowed to soften. If there is a lesson in this story, and I believe there is, It is not that infidelity should be excused or that every broken marriage can or should be repaired, because sometimes the most loving thing you can do, for yourself and for your children, is to walk away with your dignity intact. The lesson, I think, is that even in the aftermath of profound betrayal, it is possible to choose a path that leads toward healing rather than bitterness, that forgiveness is a gift you give yourself as much as anyone else, and that children have an extraordinary capacity to thrive when the adults around them choose grace over grudges, even amid heartbreak. Poppy is 13 now, thriving, kind, remarkably resilient, close with both her mother and me, and watching her grow into the confident young person she's becoming remains the proudest achievement of my entire life, far outweighing any pain from that summer afternoon on a hotel balcony 3 hours from home. Before I close this story, I want to ask you something. If this journey resonated with you in any way, I'd love for you to leave a meaningful comment below sharing what forgiveness means to you, or perhaps a moment in your own life when choosing grace over anger changed everything. Your stories, your reflections, they mean more to our community than you know, and reading them reminds all of us that we are never truly alone in our struggles. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, leave a meaningful comment, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another emotional journey. Life has a way of breaking us open in the places we least expect, but within that breaking, there is almost always room for something new to grow, something stronger and more honest than what came before. I carried divorce papers into that hotel room believing I was ending my family, and in the strangest, most unexpected way, I ended up discovering what real strength, real grace, and real love actually looked like, not in the marriage I lost, but in the father, the man, and eventually the friend I chose to become in its place. Wherever you are in your own story tonight, whatever betrayal or heartbreak you might be carrying, I hope you know that healing is possible, that forgiveness is within your reach whenever you're ready to claim it, and that on the other side of even the darkest chapters, there is still so much life, so much love, and so much hope waiting for you to find it.